Of the audience is women, so that's a good step in the right direction. My name is Laly Lichtenfeld, and I am the CEO of Tanzania People and Wildlife. And I'd like to talk a little bit today about our conflict prevention measures that we implement in northern Tanzania. There's many familiar faces, but there's also people who are not familiar with our work. So Tanzania People and Wildlife is helping rural communities to coexist with wildlife. We focus on developing the skills, the tools, and bringing out both the traditional and scientific knowledge to help communities to manage their natural resources sustainably. We're a field-based organization, so you won't find an office of ours in a big city like Dar or Arusha. You'll find us out in the bush. This was a strategic decision organizationally to ensure that every single member of our team understands what it's like to live in a rural community and understands how these communities are perceiving the environment and conservation. So we work from our field-based headquarters, the Noloholo Environmental Center, which was a piece of land that was donated to us by one of the communities that we worked for many years. We've been operating in northern Tanzania for 18 years now, initially as a research-based project, and then we co-founded the organization in 2005. And we really like to practice what we preach, so the center itself really tries to bring in the environment, a lot of open space, a lot of opportunity for people to come and to use the space to engage in conservation, to learn about the kind of work that we do, and to have a real engaging dialogue about the environment. In terms of where we're working, the star down there at the bottom, that's where our headquarters is based, just on the southeastern boundary of Tarangire National Park. And our impact in terms of organizationally, we've been working in the Tarangire-Manyara landscape for the longest period of time. So that's where we take the deepest dive with our efforts. So that would be areas 1 and 2 there. But we're also working now on the corridor between Tarangire and Manyara up to Lake Natron. It's a very critical wildlife corridor for species to pass through. And then up towards what's the nascent Natron Wildlife Management Area, number 4, and then across to West Kilimanjaro, where there's a nascent population of lions in that area as well, and then more recently in the Ngorongoro Conservation Area. And strategically, this is with the eye to maintaining connectivity for big cats across this wide landscape. We know they move incredible distances. And our organization has a very strong focus on carnivores, and particularly the big cats. And what we've been doing since 2005 is developing what we believe is a very strategic and deep model for engaging with rural communities. And it's really just 2 steps, so it's not calculus here we're talking about, but it's about both the approach and the process of working with communities. We believe very strongly that when you take a community-driven approach, when you really understand the language, the dialogue, the way people are talking about the environment, you can come together to form mutually beneficial strategies. So we really, as an organization, turn the question around. We don't come in as conservationists saying we need to protect lions or elephants. We come in and say, how do you want to protect your wildlife? Why do you want to protect your wildlife? What's in it for you? And that really turns the question around and builds an incredible dialogue with communities about conservation. And then we feel it's very important to have a strategic approach to how you engage. So we start with preventing conflict, because I think many of us know us in the room today that conflict's the powder cake. Conflict is what gets people really upset. And if you can prevent conflict, then you start to build trust. And then you can start to engage around a whole number of different issues that actually may be more difficult to address, but you've already got that trust on the ground. So then we begin to build community capacity to manage natural resources. That involves a lot of learning, information exchange between communities and our team. And we recognize that However, even when you do this kind of educational learning experience, there still may not be that much of an opportunity to change anything on the ground, because access to technical resources is very limited in rural Africa. Access to finance also very limited. So we began to support active environmental management by the conservation through grants that are actually given to community members to get something done, and the connection must come directly back to conservation. So the types of projects we support are directly linked to environmental or conservation outcomes. And then the fourth step in the process is to foster local conservation incentives. That's where you get the sustainability piece. If people are really engaged and have something to get out of the process, whether it's protecting a watershed for the long-term access to water of a community, or if it's financially by engaging in the wildlife-based tourism space, that's where you get the sustainable piece of the puzzle. So in terms of our strategic priorities, we're working on human-wildlife conflict prevention. They're very well known for that, but we also do a lot of youth and adult environmental learning. We're working in community and natural resource management, sustainable enterprise development, and of course with the overall goal of wildlife and habitat conservation. And what's really interesting about our model is it works both vertically through all of our strategic priorities, but also laterally across every single one of them. So in every single one of those priorities, you can begin the process of engaging around conflict, not always between people and wildlife, but sometimes between people and people, communities and national parks. And you can begin to engage in that four-step process of working on conflict prevention, building capacity, actively managing, and building it all around a conservation incentive. So that's just a quick overview of how we operate as an organization, but we're here today to address human-wildlife conflict. In the landscapes that we work, they're very heavily dominated by pastoralists who obviously have a very strong attachment to their wildlife, not just economically, but culturally. The herd is critical to the household and to the family in many, many different ways. And unfortunately, when the lions take people's livestock, this is what happens. People retaliate against them. It's sort of equivalent to your bank account being raided, except that every single one of your cattle may actually have a name, and you may lose your prize bull or your prize female, and so that's a very intimate raiding attack, and so lions are very quickly retaliated against by the community. So how do we look at it? Well, we started to work with local community members to actually actively monitor depredation events across the landscape and to help begin preventing conflicts. There are a number of different ways that this is done across East Africa with nuances to it, but whether you're talking about Warriors for Wildlife or other programs, these are community members that are out there actively monitoring and reacting to conflict on the ground. We have a team of 45 Warriors for Wildlife currently across 28 villages, and the way that they work is by responding in real time whenever a depredation event occurs. So we want to get on the ground and actually know what happened, what were the circumstances around the attack. And so we've built a very simple open data kit system where the monitors all have a smartphone with a set of questions that they ask at any time there's a depredation event. And this allows us to understand in real time at our environmental center what's happening on the ground across a very wide landscape of northern Tanzania. And what you see on the right, it might be a little bit difficult to see, is that the warriors are also monitoring in real time the presence of carnivores, not just lions, but also cheetahs, leopards, and wild dogs. And so we see, there's lion and leopard, wild dog here, and you see how they are expressed differently across this wide landscape. And this allows the warriors to help work with community members to say, hey, there's a pride of lions in the pasture at this part of the community at the moment, so we may want to graze our livestock somewhere else in order to avoid conflict. And one of the things that I wanted to bring out today is the nuances in conservation, and exactly why in Peter's comments he said, there's a lot of strategies out there, and there's a lot of things that we need to do, and there's no kind of one solution fits all, and that's because this is a very nuanced issue, human-wildlife conflict. From a species point of view, we see on the upper left there, that's kind of how conflict looks across the entire landscape. If we aggregate all the carnivore species, and we look at this is just pasture attacks in the wet season. So, I mean, there's so many differences, attacks in the dry season. And then when we start to parse it out by species, on the top right by leopard, bottom left hyena, bottom right by lion, we start to see anywhere that is darker on their map is where the actual animal doesn't fit the model. So it's very nuanced in terms of how different species are depredating on livestock. And so we really need to think based on, you know, our target species, what we're working on, the community points of view, how we want to address conflict in those various landscapes. And of course, this is equally nuanced from a social point of view. And here's some data that shows, in terms of just looking at depredation at the boma versus pasture in the various landscapes where we work. In some landscapes, like the Ingaruka Valley, we see about 94% of attacks occurring at the boma, at the corrals at night where people keep their livestock. But in other landscapes, like in our Maasai steppe landscape, where our Living Walls project has been running for the longest time, we're actually seeing more depredation at pasture. We see it about mixed in West Kilimanjaro, still tipping slightly to the boma, but not 100%. And so when we're working in these landscapes, we use this information in real time to help us determine where are we going to formulate our interventions and how can we best address conflict in these landscapes. And so what we do is we use this data in real time to then determine where are we going to install fortified corrals. Ours are called Living Walls, and I'll talk about them in a moment. But you see in the areas in red where we have the highest levels of boma depredation, and that's where organizationally we're currently prioritizing living wall installation. Of course, there are a lot of other factors in terms of community demand, where people are ready and would like to install living walls. So we do it across a wide landscape, but we try to prioritize on an annual basis where these installations go based on real-time evidence of conflict. And so our living walls we're installing, like I mentioned, across northern Tanzania. And living walls are a combination of trees. We started with Commiphora africana and moved to over 5 different tree species now that we use for these installations. And so they essentially develop a living fence. So this is a mature living wall. And in between the trees that are used as fence posts, we put chain link fencing. So that keeps the hyenas, the lions, anybody from getting through. And what we found is that, of course, as the trees grow, they add height to the fence. And that's what prevents a lion or a leopard from actually being able to jump into the fence, which the chain link is only about 5 feet tall. So an active lion or leopard could actually clear that quite easily if it wanted to. We've been doing this for a period of time since 2008. We have 930 and growing living walls across northern Tanzania, impacting 13,500 family members on a nightly basis. And we estimate protecting more than 150 lions across this landscape annually. We have never had a lion killed at a living wall. Organizationally, we take a very evidence-based approach, so we've also been able to publish the impact of living walls in reducing depredation quite dramatically. And so just a little bit of data to show that living walls have been shown scientifically to be effective 99.9% of the time. The only time they're not effective is when people leave the gates open and the hyena trots in, when people leave the livestock on the outside of the corral because they were too busy to herd them all in. And we finally actually had a very clever leopard that climbed a tree and jumped in. So, you know, these things are never going to be 100%, but it's doing a pretty good job. And what we've been able to see is that where we have a threshold of living walls, we see just boma depredation just plummet. So it doesn't mean that every single family must have a living wall in a community. What we're seeing, and we don't know exactly why, is that when we get up to a threshold, the situation just changes. And we believe there's some active learning that's going on with the carnivores potentially banging into living walls enough times that they sort of just drop predation at the boma as a strategy. But that's just a theory that we have. But what we see is that 94% of the individuals that have living walls indicate they save money as a result, so that's really great. They perceive them as very effective. 97.7% of people perceive them as effective. What's also interesting is that about 71% of people think that having adult herders out there is very effective in reducing attacks at pasture. And pasture attacks are a very difficult thing to address. So it's just interesting that with just a little bit of improved grazing management, improved effort, people do think they can make a difference in reducing attacks at the pasture. And what's really exciting is that we found that livestock owners with living walls are significantly more tolerant to support an increase in carnivore populations in the future. And I didn't mention, but my background is both as a wildlife ecologist and a social ecologist. And the social part of me comes out and says it's very, very, very hard to change people's attitudes because they're very, very deeply ingrained. But we can change tolerance. We can help people to be more tolerant of having these carnivores on the landscape, and living walls appear to do that. And this is just a very elegant graph here in the green at the top. I know it's a little hard to see, is our number of living wall installations in the Lake Manyara-Burungi landscape since 2013. So you see they have increased from initial installation of a little over 50 to more than 250 now in that landscape. And the red line in the middle, that's boma depredation. And again, you see, for a while it continues to increase, and then we hit some sort of a threshold, and boma depredation just drops off the map. But what's interesting is that the yellow is the pasture depredation. We don't see a dramatic increase in pasture depredation as we reduce boma depredation, which was a significant worry. And that's something that's really important to monitor. We do see it slightly increasing. We know the carnivore populations are increasing in this area. This also means carnivores are still present, so we aren't just seeing a reduction in boma depredation because all the carnivores are gone. So some really encouraging information and why we think it's very important to be monitoring this work as we go. And I just wanted to pull out some general principles that we think are important when we're working on coexistence. That we really, when we're engaging in this work with communities, we really need to recognize multiple perspectives, because that builds the trust. That opens the door to engagement and discussion around some very often volatile issues. And we need to recognize as conservationists that harm is not just being done to the wildlife, it's also being done to the people. And if we can have some sort of shared dialogue, we're going to get a lot further. We need to recognize community values and perceptions along both the technical information and the financial information. It's not always about the financial loss, it's about the attack to the person. There's a lot more going on in a conflict event than simply the loss of a cow. We need to use an evidence-based approach, again, to uncover those nuances so that we're not throwing effort in particular areas that really isn't going to result in the outcome that we're looking for. So we need to search for that best tool to fit the solution, and I think there are very many of them in the room here today. You know, often we see when there are conflict events and a number of actors get involved, it gets very heated really quick, and we need to work better with our authorities and everybody who's responding to a conflict situation to approach it from more of a peace and reconciliation approach rather than that hard stick method where everybody's angry because there's a lion lying dead on the ground next to a cow. So we really need to respond in the moment in a way that works towards resolving the situation rather than exacerbating it. We believe very strongly that strategies to prevent conflict increase that general tolerance and promote partnerships. It shows people that conservationists are there not just for the wildlife but also for the people, and builds again an incredible amount of trust. And that reflecting Peter's comments earlier this morning, we believe that preventing conflict is critical to long-term sustainability, because as the population grows, as people inevitably come in closer conflict with large species, conflict incidences are going to increase, and we need to prevent them, because otherwise we're just simply putting a Band-Aid on the problem, and it really is going to overrun us at some point in the future. And so I couldn't resist, while the topic is human-wildlife conflict here today, that from an organizational point of view, we think really preventing conflict is just the first step it gives us a little room to breathe, but we need to be looking at the whole piece of the puzzle very comprehensively. And this can be very difficult organizationally to do, but it's critical. And so from Tanzania People and Wildlife's point of view, we feel that wildlife protection is absolutely critical. We're working on that piece. Rangeland management is essential in terms of maintaining high quality pastures for both the livestock, the people, and the wildlife. We're working in the wildlife-based tourism sector to help communities get more engaged with the tourism industry, which we know in countries like Kenya and Tanzania is huge, and let such a small piece of that ends up in the hands of the communities. We need to change that. And of course, the sustainable enterprise space. We are also working with women. We find women are incredibly passionate about this work. They just get right in there and get to work. They're very, very important part of the community in terms of their voice. And so we do some micro-granting and sustainable enterprise work with women and hope to do a lot more in the future. So just to keep in mind that while we're focused on human-wildlife conflict prevention, we really need to think about the whole piece of the puzzle. And I know, again, there are many organizations that are doing that in this room today, so that's very encouraging. And if we're able to do that, then we can find the balance for both people and wildlife, which is the long-term goal and hope of Tanzania People and Wildlife. And with that, it does take quite a community to get this work done. We'd certainly like to thank all our partners and supporters, some of them listed here, but it takes all sorts of efforts, and we need to leave the ego at the door and just get the work done organizationally with our partnerships to make a better place for people and wildlife in the future. And with that, I say thank you very much, and I appreciate your time. No, but I can repeat. I can hear you.
I think I can probably speak loud enough. Two questions. Thank you very much for the presentation, fascinating. One is about the warriors. I'm interested to know what the incentive is for them to be warriors. And secondly, about the living walls. How replicable are they, and thus how sustainable are they? Do you see people who haven't been supported by your organisation establishing the walls, or do they always need that support from you to get them going?
Yep. Great question. So the first question is about what are the incentives behind the warriors getting involved? I think, you know, when you talk about these issues, they're very intimate to local people. And I think for the warriors, obviously conflict between people and large carnivores is, you know, very, very critical to the communities. So part of it is simply helping the community to resolve an issue that they find very intimately important. Obviously, there's also the prestige, the training opportunities. The warriors are given a small stipend for their efforts. So there's also the employment opportunities that they get through that. So it's a wide range of reasons why they might want to be involved in that. And in terms of your question about living wall sustainability, right now, you know, when we talk about living walls or fortified bomas, living walls are incredibly scalable in any ecosystem that has prevalent amount of Commiphora africana or any other tree species that you can use to coppice and grow. So from that point of view, it's very sustainable. The way that we do living walls is, again, and reflects an earlier comment, this is not a handout. This is not a, here you go, here we paid for all the chain link. People pay 25% of the cost. We have to recognize that it's much cheaper and much easier for somebody to go out and simply poison a lion. You can buy a tiny little bit of agricultural pesticide and you're done. So there is certainly part of this is the conservation incentive of protecting the lions, and so that's why we feel very important as an organization to share that cost, and that's why we don't require the homeowners to pay all the cost of the living wall. But yes, it does take a little bit of organization. You have to get the chain link out of these communities, so it does take some transport and logistical efforts. We have seen communities in other places and organizations across the continent interested in working with the living wall, but it definitely is a partnership between us and the communities.
My question is, do you have like an average
Sure. So the average cost for a living wall, and we found it really varies across the landscape. You have some areas where they're huge herds and other areas where they're smaller. But we put the average cost currently at around $500 per living wall, of which the community member pays 25%. So, and that price point is really critical because that means all they have to do is sell a goat or a sheep. They don't have to sell the cow, which people often don't like to do. And Michael.
Do you have a good period of the tickets that owns the trees on the fence?
Okay.
Where the predators
Okay.
are asking?
Can you?
When you plant the conifer,
Yeah.
or whatever tree you're using,
Yeah.
you have a growth period where you've seen predators trying to challenge the chain.
Great question. So the question is, are living walls effective from the beginning, essentially, or does it take a while for the trees to grow? What's really interesting is so far we found they're 100% effective from installation, and it's probably that chain link in the beginning piece. But what we also see is conifera grows really well. So we get an average growth per year of about 3 feet per tree, and we're not putting in baby trees. So you might have seen the trees are coppiced, they're quite large already. So it doesn't take very long for them to grow. And what your question is really great about is that I think we see in a lot of fortified efforts and a lot of conflict prevention efforts that people don't go back and check on how well is it going. We just install things and leave them. We make an active effort at Tanzania People and Wildlife to invest in monitoring and evaluation. So this year, every single one of our living walls, which at the beginning of the year was around 750, was visited by a team member who assessed the quality of the wall, any issues that it might have, ensured that it was still meeting its original objectives. And I think that's really important because you see other models where the fences don't stand up the test of time. And so then that's an investment that really hasn't done anything in the long term.